Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and I just wanted to quickly chime in a little bit about the minimum wage, just because the minimum wage always comes up. This particularly came up just because it was an article about sort of the effect of the minimum wage in New York City far as costs and restaurant jobs and whatnot, and this is something that's easy to understand. Now, you'll always hear people respond saying, well, if a business can't pay somebody enough to have a living wage, and they shouldn't be in business at all. But then the person just has no job and has no wage and is much worse off than before because those jobs just don't exist. And just because they're out of business doesn't necessarily mean some job's going to pop up somewhere else. It's just like I'd rather people have nothing than something attitude, which is just really weird. But let's just talk about sort of the policy implications, sort of like how this all works. Okay, so the problem with the minimum wage is in several factors, okay? And it doesn't necessarily mean that no one benefits from the minimum wage. There are winners and there are losers. The question is the cost worth the benefit? And there's a lot of costs that people don't factor in. So what I want to focus on first is sort of the cost of dispersion and the political costs, which I've talked about less in previous discussions of the minimum wage. So what does this mean? Okay, number one, dispersion, meaning this was something I heard in I can't remember which podcast I heard this in, but this was actually a really interesting point that what happens a lot of times, it's hard to create an experiment to really measure the effect of a minimum wage. Because let's say you increase the minimum wage in Seattle or New York City quite a bit. This is definitely going to incentivize a company to maybe start thinking about capital investments, meaning developing an automated checkout, developing tools where they can reduce their labor. Why? Because the cost of labor is higher, so the return on investment of investing in the capital is not much higher. Like, let's say you paid less for labor, then it's not worth investing in the machine because the regular cost and maintenance of the machine may, over the long run, may exceed the cost of just paying people to do it in the long run. There's always this sort of cost balance calculation going on. But the thing is that if you raise the minimum wage in, let's say, Seattle, and I invest in machines to help save me some of the labor costs in Seattle, once I've developed that machine, there's no reason why I wouldn't use it everywhere else. So then what happens is that when somewhere like Seattle raises the minimum wage, and this creates an incentive to innovate, to reduce those labor costs, that causes a drop in the demand for labor, not just there, but everywhere. Because let's say, if you're talking about like a national company, well, I'm like, okay, if I'm McDonald's or something, I'm like, okay, well, if I already have the kiosk here, I might as well use it everywhere. So then what happens when you look at the data, you don't see that those effects necessarily isolated just to Seattle. So then it's kind of hard to sit there and say, well, the minimum wage caused that. Here's the effects of minimum wage, because the effects can sort of mirror outwards. And that's one thing. And also there's the political costs. So what happens is if you're a large business, let's say you're like a McDonald's or something like that, you could, invest in capital to deal with those labor costs. You have the scale to do so. Also, you have a little bit more wiggle room cost-wise to do that. Maybe McDonald's is the best example because of they don't run most of their stores. But bigger companies, they can probably afford the higher labor costs relative. Why? Because they're going to do more business. Why are they going to do more business? Because all their competitors who are smaller, who cannot deal with those labor costs, are going to struggle and go out of business. Okay, this does mean less jobs at those other stores. Yes, the people who are still working at, let's say, again, using the example of McDonald's just to keep it simple, they're better off because they're getting paid more for the same work. But all those people who worked at their competitors who now can't afford to stay open, they're not better off because now that business is out, those people, employees, and then what happens is that business now captures a larger market share and is a much larger proportional employer relative to the grander labor market, which gives them a lot more political power. So you've just given more political power to the larger players. So things like this that create cost creep, things that basically oftentimes always hit hardest on the smallest actors, the smaller businesses, the medium-sized businesses. And while a lot of times legislation tries to tier these things, so they'll say, hey, if you have this many employees, the minimum wage is this. If you have this many employees, the minimum wage is that. They're still more sensitive to it. And even if you're tiered, oftentimes it still hits them harder. And then the result is you empower those big companies. So if you're worried about big multinational corporations having more political power, the minimum wage actually gives them more political power. And generally that's the same logic with all regulations, all sort of costs on businesses, because bigger businesses can afford to deal with those costs a lot better than a smaller business does. So it oftentimes forces consolidation. I mean, this is what happened with a lot of the regulation in the financial industry after Dodd-Frank. A lot of financial firms consolidated. Same thing in healthcare. A lot of firms are consolidating. So instead of having a lot of smaller players that have more dispersed political power, meaning it's hard for them to control the system politically, you now have a couple big players that have a huge political weight because they're such a large employer, which makes their ability to affect political outcomes that much greater. Okay, so then you're just kind of inviting this sort of more corrupt environment. So those are sort of two things I don't think people talk about enough. Sort of like, again, there's nothing wrong with innovation and automation. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean companies aren't going to invest in automating otherwise. The question is what particular automations or innovations they're going to invest in. It's going to depend on their costs. So if you increase the costs in one area, particularly labor, then that's where they're going to focus. There's other places where they can reduce their costs, and people are always going to naturally try to reduce their highest costs first. So the more pressure you put on there, and the problem is then you have less people with less jobs, and so they can't pay for things. And then for those companies who can't keep up, who can't innovate away those costs, they're going to have to charge more. So then people suddenly, even though they may have a higher paycheck, they're still not buying any more stuff because the price of stuff just went up in some regards. And the companies who can keep their prices from going up probably had to lay off people. So you're giving and taking. There's not like a magical win here. And then, of course, it's just the natural problems with minimum wage, which is that it does create less demand for labor because, all things being equal. Now, of course, people will sit there and say, hey, well, you see higher productivity levels with a higher minimum wage. Why? Because basically if you're paying people more, they'll say productivity levels rise, which can happen in two different ways. One, yes, people who get paid more are going to care more about their job, so they're going to try harder on it. But that doesn't necessarily mean everyone does. The other sort of way this ends up working out is that since you're paying more per hour, you try to hire someone who is worth more per hour. So you hire better employees because you have to pay so little. You have to pay this much, so you might as well hire someone that, now you have an option to hire some better employees. Because before, when I could pay 8, I was a little bit less picky about who I picked. Because I was paying less, but at least those people were able to get a job. Now that I'm 15, there's now people who are applying for the job that didn't apply for the job before, that they're a little bit better. I'm going to hire them. But the problem is that person who's a little bit more productive, yes, my firm may be more productive now because because I have these employees who are better because you're forcing me to pay more. But at the same time, that's not necessarily the best use for them. Okay? If I could have gotten by with $8 an hour productivity workers, then those $15 an hour productivity workers may have been better used elsewhere. So you're kind of taking productivity from somewhere else in the economy that might have better used it. So that's not necessarily a good thing. Because people will sit there and say, well, productivity level increases. Sure. But you have to take a look at the big picture. So there's a lot of vectors at which the minimum wage can be sort of this just doesn't work. And if you raise the minimum wage just a little bit, that it doesn't have that much of an effect, well, then it doesn't have that much an effect, positive or negative. That's why, because there is a natural sort of wage level. So if the minimum wage theoretically was sort of below sort of that average sort of market wage level, it'll still have an effect, but it'll be less pronounced, it'll be less measurable, whatnot. If you raise it a whole lot, that effect isn't immeasurable. And even people who are sort of pro minimum wage generally will agree that there's a point where you do raise it too much. But that's when you start really, like if you were to sit there and take a look at what people think is a living wage, and again, what's a living wage depends on where you live. There's also the different factors that just creating sort of this blanket number doesn't factor in as far as what the demands of the job are, the relative incentives to people for how they specialize their skills and how they educate themselves, because you're creating different incentives and what choices they have available to them. There's all sorts of distortions that are just not good. So I just wanted to share that. Again, go head over to alexmerced.com. Become a supporter by going to donate.alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.